Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
Vanessa, welcome to Season 5! We did it! We're back!
We are back, yes. Remember when we said we were going to be back next week, and here it is a few weeks later? Whoops!
I apologize, but we do not keep our promises on this show, apparently.
I think we have to stop making promises on mic because we tend to break them in this trying time.
In fact, I think when we make promises, we're pretty much guaranteed to break them. It's a weird irony thing going on with us.
Yeah, but hopefully we won't be breaking any more promises and we'll be getting back to our regularly scheduled programming.
But no promises, because this is a time of great upheaval in the land of MASHmouth, apparently. We should give people an update that you are now a barred attorney.
I am.
You've crossed that milestone.
Yes. Part of the reason that we didn't jump right into season 5 after season 4 was because I found out that I passed the bar. And also, now that I'm working as an attorney, it is quite difficult to manage two schedules. But we are back. We are going to try as hard as we can to just do everything that we can to get MASHmouth out on a timely basis.
Yes. Apologies if there's some gaps here and there, but we love hearing from you guys. We know a lot of people like this show, so we're not going anywhere. It's just going to take us a little more time than might be typical of other rewatch podcasts, and we apologize for that.
Yes, but here we are in season 5. So something that we do at the beginning of every new season is talk about the top 5 episodes that we would choose to show someone to introduce them to MASH. So Ethan, I have to ask you, what are your episodes that you would show someone?
Okay, so this gets harder and harder every season that we do this because, you know, we're further into the show, so it's harder to recommend like intro episodes. But I think I came up with a pretty good list that encompasses the entire show so far.
Okay, I'm excited.
My list would be Sometimes You Hear the Bullet, Deal Me Out, Adam's Rib, The Late Captain Pierce, and The More I See You. I feel like these are all really good stories that kind of encompass a range, you know, without having to know too much about the individual characters. Particularly Deal Me Out, I think, is a really fun episode. The more I think back on that one.
I love that list because a lot of my episodes also encompass your list.
Ooh.
So my episodes would be Sometimes You Hear the Bullet, Deal Me Out, Payday, The Novocaine Mutiny, and Hey Doc. Now, I have to preface that these are not my favorite episodes, even though some of them are 5 stars and some of them are my favorite episodes. These are just the ones that I feel like would be really good to show somebody for the first time.
Mm-hmm. I think the soap opera sequence in The Novocaine Mutiny is like a really fun example of the show's kind of like weird filmmaking prowess that they occasionally do. I debated putting The Interview on this list, but I was like, does that episode hit hard if you don't know who Captain Pierce is? Like, it kind of... This takes a lot more thought than you would think it would.
And honestly, I'm always so curious as to what episodes other people would introduce somebody to MASH to. So if anybody wants to tell us, please let us know.
Absolutely. Please let us know.
So I can't wait to hear about your thoughts on this episode because, oh boy, I have a lot of them.
Yes, this is your favorite season, is it not?
I think this is one of my favorite seasons. For sure. I think this might be my favorite season. Yeah, definitely.
You're really hyping it up that there are a lot of your favorite episodes in here, and I cannot wait to get to that. I'm very excited to talk about this whole season with you.
Yes, me too. I'm so excited to hear what your thoughts are as a fresh viewer of this season. Oh, I'm so excited.
I'm excited too. And let's get into this episode, the season premiere, Bug Out. In this episode, the 4077 has to evacuate fast when the enemies start heading their way. But things get complicated for Hawkeye, Margaret, and Radar when they have to stay behind with a severely wounded soldier while he makes his recovery. Vanessa, what did you think of this episode?
So, this is one of my favorite episodes. And it was one of my favorite episodes as a kid. So it really, really did it for me watching this again and getting to talk about it. I think that this episode really has a lot to say without saying too much. And it kind of gives us a nice roadmap for where the characters are going in the rest of this season and also in the rest of this series. So watching it again reconfirmed that I do love this episode. It is one of my favorites. And I am excited to hear your thoughts. So what did you think about this episode, Ethan?
I like this episode a lot. I cannot say that it's one of my favorites, but I think this is a very strong season opener. I saw this episode kind of as a metaphor for the show itself, because this season we have the departure of Larry Gelbart, where the show is now produced by a new team of people, but, you know, people who were working on the show previously, but now they stepped up roles, I believe. And them having to change camp location, I was like, oh, this is a metaphor for how the show is changing and that they're going to start fresh. And then, spoiler, at the end of the episode, they're back at their regular camp location. So I'm like, oh, there goes my metaphor theory. But, you know, for most of this, I was like, I figured out the code. This is all a secret fourth wall break of how things are changing in this new season.
Well, I think that it could still honestly work, your metaphor, because it might be, yes, we're changing location, but we are still the same show. We are still the same MASH. So don't you worry, audience.
Yes, don't worry, audience. We're still here. We're still making MASH. It might be different now, but everything will be fine. And this episode, like the previous season opener, is a two-parter. And I think this is an interesting two-parter because it is very much one continuous story. And with the first half, it is very much focused on how they believe they will not be bugging out. And the later realization that, yes, in fact, they have to move.
Yeah, and why don't we get into the actual plot of this episode?
Yes.
So, as you said, originally, there's this rumor that they were supposed to be bugging out, that the 4077 was too close to the enemy line and that they had to retreat and go somewhere much safer away from enemy fire. So I really liked how this was set up. It was, if you couldn't tell by the name of the episode, it kind of spoiled it a little bit, like, oh, you know, a bug out. So,
see, I didn't know what that meant. So I wasn't spoiled by the title. I was like, oh, that's what a bug out means. I'm very illiterate with military terminology, as you can tell, probably from listening to the show.
Okay, so that's good to know then. So I think that they then explained it for the audience, like you, Ethan, who kind of didn't know what the terminology meant. So that was kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think that then, maybe because I've watched this episode several times, I knew it was coming. But you kind of get this feeling of like, okay, it's called bug out because, like, are they going to bug out? Are they not going to bug out? And I really liked how, even though it was quote unquote a rumor that they were supposed to be bugging out, when the rumor was laid to rest originally, everybody in the camp still believed that they were going to bug out. So I really liked the almost like will they, won't they of this episode of retreating. So it was a lot of fun.
The nervous tension in the first half of the first part of this episode, I think, is really fun. That kind of no one believes that they're going to stay put, that everyone has this manic, frantic energy of like, changes are coming. And it was funny to see everyone deal with it, especially Colonel Potter trying to keep everybody like calm and collected. It was very much like taking care of children. He's like, has to keep his kids in line, being like, no, listen to me. Everything's going to be fine. And they're like, no. We're freaking out here, man. We got to go.
And it was funny because with everybody in the camp and even the locals too, they were saying how, you know, oh, we're definitely bugging out. And I was wondering if it was maybe wishful thinking of like, oh yeah, we're bugging out. So I don't have to like build a latrine. I don't have to cook today. Like all that kind of stuff. So I thought that was very funny.
I don't have to clean my room if we're moving.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's happened to somebody.
So besides the bug out of it all, what was really interesting to me in this episode was that at first, it did not feel like the reintroduction of the show that we're kind of used to from the season premieres, because I think that season 1, season 2, season 3, even season 4, it was kind of a reestablishment of like what the show was and who the characters were and stuff like that. So at first, I really didn't get that vibe. And I thought that it was a lot of fun because the characters felt really grounded. The writers trusted the audience at this point, that they had been watching for a little while, that they enjoyed the show, that they knew who these people were, what they were there for, what, you know, the dynamics were and stuff like that. So I really appreciated how well everybody was like kind of sitting together. And then my thoughts on that changed a little bit, which I'll save for closer to the end of the episode. But yeah, I really liked how the writers kind of just trusted us, that we knew who these people were and that we had been here for at least a little while.
Yeah, I guess that's the benefit of being in season 5 when there is, you know, 100 episode backlog at this point. Maybe it's playing in reruns. Like they trust the audience to kind of know the show at this point. But I was thinking in terms of reintroduction that, you know, the show is called MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and this is the first time that we really get to see that mobile aspect of the surgical hospital. So it did kind of feel like a premiere in that sense, that like, oh, things are moving. We're actually taking advantage of the core concept of our title. I understand what you mean in terms of like character dynamics being pretty settled, but them introducing the move felt like a big like season premiere special event kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, actually. That's so fun to see the move, because we kind of hadn't seen that before, not in this really big way. And it was funny because, I don't know if you remember this, but I believe it was when Frank was in command for some reason, either when Henry was gone and before Colonel Potter showed up, or when Henry was on R&R and the earlier season, something. Frank had made the entire camp move and like 10 feet down the road and then come back, but we had not seen that on screen. It was just referenced. And I thought it was really funny when they get the news that they actually are bugging out, which, by the way, was like such a MASH-ism, I felt, because Colonel Potter was saying, we're absolutely bugging out in 3 hours. It was so good. Colonel Potter had asked Frank, have you ever bugged out before? And I liked that because at this point, Colonel Potter has been there for a while, but he doesn't know if they have had to bug out before. So I thought that was really good continuity of character as well.
Yeah.
But Frank said, not intentionally. Yes. And I just think I would like to believe that that's the writers kind of giving us a wink and a nod of saying, like, yes, do you remember Frank being an absolute imbecile and making the move all the way down the street and then come back? So no, he didn't bug out intentionally, but he did in fact do it.
See, what I remember from when Frank is in charge, that he really wants the rocks all painted. That's the thing that sticks with me whenever he's in charge, when he whitewashes them for whatever reason. But that is really funny. And going along with the continuity of character, with Potter not knowing whether or not they bugged out before, I did think it was cool that in the beginning of this episode, they're building a latrine, and BJ was like, oh, I've never been here for a latrine building, which... just another great thing to show that he is still new here. He's still not quite fully up on the culture of how things work. That was just a nice little thing to remind us, like, oh, BJ's still the new guy. And I really like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this season really, because we have had a full season of Colonel Potter and BJ, I think that now is the season where they kind of start to, you know, lose that shine of being like the new guys. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even though it is kind of hinted at in this episode, I do think that they become a lot more grounded in this season. And in terms of continuity, I really liked how in this episode, they had said that the Chinese were fast approaching. They didn't say the North Koreans. They specifically were saying that it was the Chinese. And in the episode Deluge from last season, that was the one with all the newsreels. The newsreels had said that China had entered the war at this point. And I was like, oh, that was like, again, it was just tickling the continuity aspect of my brain so much that it was kind of carrying over from last season, like kind of telling us where we were in the timeline. So that really, really did it for me too.
That is really cool. I love that. I didn't think of that, but it's one of those subtle things. Probably telling us that it's only been in like a few days since Deluge. I love
true.
the compressed timeline of this show that you could probably map it all on like 11 seasons of content, but you probably could map the show onto the proper like 2 or 3 years that they're in Korea pretty well if you like really tried to fudge it a little bit.
I think so. And one great resource for tracking the timeline too is the Monster Mash Wiki.
Ooh.
The contributors of that page will note when dates are said or when specific historical events happen and kind of match up and talk about how the timeline like kind of gets reset with each episode that happens in. So if anyone's curious about like more timeline stuff, I would definitely head to the MASH fan wiki.
And in terms of time passing, one thing that's very noticeable every time there's a new season is that Alan Alda's hair just gets more and more gray. This season, I feel this episode, he's very gray, especially in the sunlight. Like, I was like, wow, Buddy's losing that color in his hair.
And we're not laughing at gray hair specifically because as somebody who is going prematurely gray before the age of 30, I sympathize and empathize and everything with the people who are graying.
We love our silver foxes.
We do.
Also, I fully thought that BJ would have a mustache in the beginning of the season. I thought they were going to reveal it. I thought his mustache was going to be here.
I don't know when the mustache comes in, but I know it's soon.
I'm waiting for it.
It's going to be soon. We'll make a big spectacled episode of this of it when it comes out.
We'll Photoshop mustaches onto our cover art. Me
funny.
and you.
So at this point in the episode, we've found out that the bug out is in fact happening, and as I said, it was such a MASH way of doing it, of Colonel Potter getting the information as he's saying that they're not bugging out, and then they all scramble and they're running into each other. It was just such a quintessential MASH scene. A lot of the scenes in this episode were.
The scrambling was really funny physical comedy for me.
It was so good. But the scenes where they're like actually bugging out were really, really good. And when they're packing up the camp, it was no dialogue, but it was only frantic packing and loading wounded onto buses and stuff over the sound of really ominous drum beats. And the shots and angles were really cool, like cinematography wise. It was just really well done. I really liked this scene. Yeah,
it was a fun montage. And I loved, obviously you mentioned like the wounded, but I love the more non-serious stuff. I love like Klinger marching out of the porta potty with like a wall of toilet paper on like a stick. It was so funny to watch, and he was like singing a song, and it was like that kind of stuff really made me laugh.
It was really good. It was also, in terms of like reintroducing, like I said, it wasn't like a super reintroduction episode at this point in time, I feel, but it does remind the audience of what they can do and the innovativeness of shooting outside rather than on a soundstage. So I did like that too.
There is a lot of cool cinematography in this episode, and it's in the back half of the episode, but even stuff with like pyrotechnics and, them flying the helicopters, we see like a helicopter POV angle of them like scouting out a new camp. Like that kind of stuff I loved. Really shows the production value of this show when it wants to have it.
Yeah.
And them breaking down the camp was so interesting to watch because it was at some point just completely gone. It was cool to see because it's such a familiarity at this point that it being gone was like made me sadder than I realized it would. Even there's an entire scene dedicated to Frank wanting to just ditch the still that they have. And it was BJ defending the still, and obviously he's been there for less time than, say, Trapper would. But even then, I'm like, you can't take apart that still. That still's part of the family. It needs to go with you.
Yeah, and speaking of the still and all of the things that Frank was not allowing people to bring, we have to talk about how Colonel Potter made the fatal mistake of putting Frank Burns in charge of overseeing the bug out of the 4077 because, oh boy, Oh boy, if there is one person less equipped to do this, it's Frank Burns.
100%. This was a fatal flaw in Potter's plan this episode. Honestly, a little out of character because we know he doesn't like Frank, and they do justify it by saying, like, oh, you're second in command. But, like, come on, man. You couldn't have, like, anybody else do this? But you're right. Frank was peak Frank, very much insufferable, very much using him well. You know, I feel like it's been a few episodes since we've seen Frank used well, and this is one of the first times in a while that I'm like, oh, we're back to classic Frank. This felt very classic to me.
It really did. And I think that Colonel Potter, to give him a little bit of credit for putting Frank in charge of this, I don't think he had anybody else to put in charge of it. Because suppose Hawkeye and BJ and Margaret were all at this point with the patient, who we haven't even discussed yet, actually.
Right.
Which we'll get to. But yeah, so this was, I agree, Frank utilized really well. It brought a lot of comedy to the episode, and it also made me really angry because Frank said that Klinger couldn't bring his dresses, Radar couldn't bring his animals, and BJ couldn't bring the still from this swamp. And honestly, yes, it's not nice to tell Klinger, you can't bring your clothes. It's not nice to tell BJ, you can't bring the alcohol. But to tell Radar that he can't bring his pets, little animals in cages, like, how? To get, like, bombed and killed? That's terrible.
I 100% agree. In fact, I'm on Frank's side with the still. Like, that in terms of military whatever, you know, it's not legal equipment. I love the still, but from the Frank perspective, I can agree with him where he's coming from. They can build a new still. However, you can't build new animals, dude. Those guys are living creatures. They could get hurt. It like, that made me feel bad in a big way. I was so happy when they revealed the kind of secret plan that BJ, Klinger, and Radar came up with of hauling their personal effects secretly. I was like, okay, thank God. These animals are not going to be left behind. Because I have not seen this episode. I didn't really know how it was going to work out mechanically, if they were going to be able to bring up new stuff, or, you know, Klinger gets a new Klinger collection and they get a new still. I was like, I don't know how we're going to get a new animal farm, but I'm sure it'll work out, and it did. So I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, it was very telling also how Frank, when he was telling Radar that he couldn't bring the animals along to the bug out or along to their new compound, that he had a single pet as a child, and it was a canary.
Right.
And it never sang, and it bit him. And honestly, that just tracks for Frank Burns. Like, when the animals don't like you, you know you have a problem.
It was a very Frank story. That felt like a season 1 Frank line right there.
It did. And I think that part of the reason that I love this episode so much was because all the one-liners were so good.
Just a quick note before we move on. I do think it's really funny that Klinger's collection of dresses is officially referred to as the Klinger Collection.
Yes.
TM.
Yes.
His own fashion line going.
I think that if somebody wants to appeal to a very small subset of people, a fashion designer could very much make clothes that are inspired by the Klinger dresses and Klinger's collection and call it the Klinger Collection. I think that would be amazing.
If this show was produced now, I would love to see like a collab pop-up event where you could like buy Klinger Collection replicas by like some, you know, internet clothing brand that I feel like they do sometimes, you know. Can't name a specific example, but I know there's TV show clothing crossovers that I would love to see with MASH.
That would be a lot of fun. And there's a lot to work with because there is the beautiful MASH green and also all of Klinger's dresses. So, you know, where is it? Honestly, 2024, where is it?
I would wear a replica of Radar's hat every day. Don't even sweat it.
So while all this bugging out is going on, there is the kind of, I guess, B plot of this episode, or the parallel plot of this episode with Hawkeye and Margaret and eventually Radar. So Hawkeye had been operating on this wounded soldier who had a spinal injury, and it is not Hawkeye's specialty as a spinal surgeon. He is a chest specialist, and Colonel Potter says to him in the beginning of the episode, well, your specialty just changed because they couldn't get a thoracic surgeon from the 8063rd. So, great.
Very high pressure situation.
Yes, and it was actually really interesting because as Hawkeye, Margaret, and BJ are operating or about to operate on this kid, Hawkeye starts like getting really snappy and short with BJ, and you can tell that he's nervous. It's done really, really well without ever saying, oh, I'm nervous. Hawkeye just says like, I'm sorry, BJ. And I thought that was really, really well done.
I really liked this little moment of annoyance from Hawkeye because I feel like it's the first time that him and BJ kind of like really snapped at each other. And it's a very quick moment, but I think, like you said, really illustrates how far he feels out of his depth. It added to the tension of this episode in a big way for being such a subtle moment.
Yeah, definitely. It was really well done, and really well acted by both Mike Farrell and Alan Alda here.
And I love this storyline in general. I think it added so much tension and kind of stakes of the episode where not only do they have to successfully perform this operation that they're out of their depth in, but it gives them a real concrete reason to stay behind while everyone else is bugging out. And that, I think, added a great layer of like depth to this episode, because like we've been talking about, the rest of this episode is so like light and fun with everybody like moving and kind of acting all silly as they try to like pack their stuff away. But Hawkeye, Margaret, and Radar having to stay behind with this patient added the drama to it in a very natural way of something like that would happen in the scenario. And I really liked this part.
Yeah, and most of the tension wasn't even from the surgery itself. It was from the aftermath and the recovery, because they established that once this kid pulls through, he cannot be moved or move for 24 hours after the surgery. And that's the reason that Hawkeye and Margaret and eventually Radar do have to stay behind. So the bug out came at the worst possible time.
Yeah. And after they were assured that there would be no bug out.
Exactly.
Which turns the like comedic side of this episode into having a little more tension too, because once they say we're going to operate on this kid because there's going to be no bug out, you'll be like, there's a bug out though. I know that's coming.
Of course. And with staying behind too, what I really liked about this scene with Hawkeye staying with the patient while he recovered was that it was kind of uncontested, uncontroverted that Hawkeye was absolutely going to stay. And, you kind of understand that as Hawkeye, who he is, the main character, this, that, and the other thing. What I really enjoyed was how Margaret also was kind of like, yeah, of course I'm staying. I'm not going to let you do this by yourself. I'm the head nurse. I'm going to be here with you. And this is what I meant before when I said that the reintroduction of the characters didn't feel so staunch as it did in other seasons. But with Margaret here, it really did. Because I think the writers were kind of going in the direction that Margaret's character was going to take in the rest of the series here. So the writers were reintroducing us to who Margaret actually is. And I really enjoyed that.
See, I knew you were going to have a lot to say about Margaret in this episode. I agree, even without seeing the rest of the series, that this felt like the turning point that you've been talking up for a while, that one day Margaret will become like more of a real person. And this felt like that. And that's not to say that we haven't seen this kind of kinder, more humanistic side of her. But I feel like as the season premiere, where it's not her like fawning over Frank or trying to be like the second in command, it is her supporting Hawkeye in this really selfless way was a very solid, very cool reintroduction to her character. And everything with this kind of latter half of everyone back at camp, because Radar's there too, was such a fun combo. The Radar, Margaret, Hawkeye combo was so interesting to watch. It was very unique.
Yeah, and the other thing that I just really thought was so good about this quote-unquote reintroduction of Margaret was her with Hawkeye. She was kind of shown as almost his like female counterpart. They were really seen as equals in this scene and for the rest of this two-parter episode. The writers were showing that Margaret is just as dedicated to the patients and the work as Hawkeye is, to the point where she's not leaving him. She's not leaving a patient that she worked on, just as Hawkeye wasn't leaving a patient that he was working on. And she also wasn't going to leave a coworker in danger. And we had seen that a little bit in the past season too, of just one of the last episodes of season 4 when Margaret was saying to Colonel Potter, like, hey, listen, trust me, you know, I can keep the nurses safe and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That continuity of character with her was pretty strong here too. And I really liked how, even though Hawkeye was still kind of cracking inappropriate jokes and maybe doing inappropriate sexual things,
right,
Margaret was handling it so much better than she was previously. I just remember this one scene in season 1 where she like went off and cried, you know what I mean? And it just her kind of taking it in stride. Not that it's like right, but she is kind of one of the guys and kind of taking it in stride now. And it was just so great to see.
Yeah, there definitely was a different energy in terms of the pseudo flirtation that her and Hawkeye occasionally have. It did feel a little more like even-handed. Despite the joke about Hawkeye, like, maybe grabbing her butt in the dark, there was, you know, a little bit more mutual respect going on.
Yeah.
At least it felt like that to me anyway. And like I said, I like this whole section of the episode where it is this small gang all in camp together trying to just work on this guy. And I honestly wish there was a little more of it. I wish there was a little more focus, because this setup of them trying to tend to this patient for 24 hours while the enemy line is literally coming over them as they speak had so much tension and like was so ripe for drama and was kind of scary that I felt like they could have done a little bit more with it. But I understand why they didn't go that far, because it's still like a comedy show. So I suppose there's a balance to it.
Yeah, I do know what you mean, though, because I really, really enjoyed this little trio, like the A-team over here, just really holding it down for this patient. And I thought it was great character growth for Radar as well, when he kind of was seeing everybody off and telling Klinger, you know, make sure my animals get fed and they get this and feed them at this time and stuff like that. And then he hangs back and Hawkeye says, what are you doing back here? And Radar just says, you might need me. And they don't argue about it.
Yeah.
There's no back and forth. There is just this mutual understanding and respect that, yeah, they probably will need Radar. And they're not going to fight him on it. And I also think that Radar was so mature here. Like, he wasn't just some scared kid who was following blindly the commanding officer. He was like, okay, I know what my role is. I know that they're probably going to need me way more than they're going to need me at whatever compound they find themselves in, like the rest of the camp. So he hung back. And I feel like that was just him really maturing and becoming, like a man almost.
Yeah, I didn't even think about the maturity contrast, because this episode starts with him repairing his teddy bear. So it is like a nice little like pseudo character arc where he may still be interested in keeping his childhood toy safe, but he is a man in the sense that he is willing to do this very brave thing. It is really cool, and I feel like that's kind of a subtle thing throughout the episode. Even when they go to Rosie's bar, I thought it was really funny that he wanted a grape soda, or like would settle for anything, but Hawkeye got him a grape soda.
Yeah.
That just made me laugh like pretty hard.
Yeah, I loved that scene in Rosie's bar too. It just felt I don't know, it felt almost like in a movie, you know what I mean? I can't exactly describe it, but the dialogue, the humor, it was all just very like 1970s war film type of thing.
Mm-hmm. It was a nice digression from the main plot, where it was just kind of a small character interaction, where it wasn't even, I know I said I laughed at the grape soda joke, but there wasn't even a lot of jokes. There was a lot of like, Rosie was like, you have to go. It added to the tension again. It was, I think, something that benefited from the longer runtime of being a two-parter, that they had the space to do a tangential moment of just these two characters in a room talking to each other during this very trying circumstance, unrelated to the patient.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, speaking of the tension too, one other scene in this kind of amalgamation of Hawkeye, Radar, and Margaret was this part where Hawkeye and Margaret were really being vulnerable with each other. They were talking about how they were scared. Margaret was more like visibly upset and scared about what was going to happen and whatnot. And she says to Hawkeye, like, how are you not scared? And Hawkeye says, no, trust me, I'm terrified. I'm just not showing it.
His whole body's a white knuckle.
Yeah, it was so funny. And I thought that it was a great callback from last season in the interview when Hawkeye said to the interviewer, you know, you can't let yourself feel or it'll drown you. And I thought that that was kind of what he was doing here with his fear in this moment. He was just as scared as Margaret, but he wasn't able to like kind of let it out because he knew that it would kind of overtake him. And I thought that that was just really well done again from last season. And I really liked the shot of Hawkeye and Radar walking away to Rosie's bar and Margaret kind of sitting looking at the patient, just like kind of being worried, like holding her head in her hands and stuff like that. And I thought that it really showed how different the characters were dealing with the same situation. So I thought that it was really great writing here, great directing, great acting, and it was just one of my favorite scenes, this little tiny bit where they're talking about fear with each other.
Yeah, this section with them alone definitely elevates the episode to a high degree for me. And with what you're saying, how Hawkeye's fear is kind of a callback to the last episode, I do have to say that I love that that is a consistent character trait for him at this point, that he is very open about talking about how he feels, even if he doesn't outwardly show it. I think it's a very interesting character quirk of his, that he is scared and he's willing to say he's scared, but you know, he's holds it together pretty well. And along with the last episode, on a lighter note, I thought it was very funny that the helicopter pilot, while Colonel Potter was scouting out a new location for a MASH unit, had just a million bananas. And I was like, yo, you gotta give some of those bananas to Hawkeye, because that's what he wanted last episode.
I did not notice that. Oh my god, that's so funny. I completely missed that. What the heck? Oh my god.
Maybe that's in the DVD cut? I don't know. I'm gonna have to watch the Hulu cut.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and watch this scene that you're talking about, because I'm like, huh? Also, yeah, give Hawkeye some bananas. Seriously.
Hi, everybody. This is Ethan from the future, editing this episode. Sorry for the interruption, but I wanted to clarify that Vanessa and I watched two separate versions of the episode. I watched it on DVD, which presents the season opener as a single 48-minute special. Vanessa watched it on Hulu, which divides the premiere into two separate episodes. Evidently, the Hulu version cut out content that was available in the DVD version, mainly the scene where the helicopter pilot offers Colonel Potter some bananas. This is fascinating to me. If anybody out there knows of any more content cut from the Hulu versions, please let us know. Because if not for this quick tangent, I would have never known this was a thing. Anyway, sorry for the interruption. Let's get back to the main conversation already in progress.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
This is the first time I've had you on the back foot. Usually you'll mention something and be like, oh my god, yeah! But this time, I'm like the MASH aficionado.
The other time, was when you were like, this is the first time they gave Radar a name. I'm like, no, get out of here. And we spent like 15 minutes trying to figure out if it was true or not. I was like freaking out. Hear me, oh Lord. Okay, so while Hawkeye and Margaret and Radar are dealing with the gravity of the situation, there is a little bit more of a fun, lighthearted moment when the rest of the camp is arriving at the new MASH compound. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if this had the same impact on you as it did me, but when they arrive at the MASH compound, Father Mulcahy says that it's like tradition to bless the new compound, and they are all in a huge line of jeeps and ambulances and stuff like that. So they're kind of doing a line of telephone of what everybody's saying in the front, like screaming instructions, whatnot. So Father Mulcahy starts this blessing, and he says, "Hear me, O Lord." And then Frank screams it, BJ screams it, and they just keep screaming, "Hear me, O Lord." And that has stuck with me since childhood. I don't know why, really funny. But it just really sticks with me. And sometimes I will say, "Hear me, O Lord," for no reason.
You literally just said it while you, like, between segments. See, that's so funny, because that is definitely the kind of gag that I can see sticking in my brain forever if I see it at a young enough age. That was a very, like, 70s Monty Python, like, classic shenanigans humor. And the way that it started, I legitimately was like, are they going to do the whole prayer like this way? Is it going to be like a 5-minute gag? And then how it ends, I think, is really funny. That Father Mulcahy doesn't even look offended that they're doing this. He just looks confused. And Potter's just like, "Frank, you're being a silly Billy right now. He does a one-man show," which is a great way to wrap up the gag without it going on forever.
Yeah. It was just like a very quintessential MASH 70s sitcom type of moment. Like, that is just so sitcom humor to me. And it stuck with me. It's one very of my classical favorites. So not to bring down the mood, but I do actually have something to say about Father Mulcahy's prayer. And it goes along with the commentary in this episode. It was definitely very subtle. There were a few lines of like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, this like American bureaucracy, hypocrisy type of thing. So Father Mulcahy, in one of his lines in this prayer, says, he is asking God for a speedy end to the war. I mean, police action. And he goes, "Well, you know what I mean, Lord." And it was really subtle, but it was actually really strong if you thought about it, because I took it as, people can say that this is a police action. They can say whatever they want about the war. They can say that it's not as bad, or that America is winning, or that this side is winning, that side's winning, and we're doing this for whatever reason. But really, God knows what's actually happening and what's really going on. And no matter what spin people put on it, there's a higher power that really knows what's at play here. So I thought that was really well done.
Wow, we are getting deep and profound with this episode of MASHmouth today. I don't even disagree. That's pretty funny. I didn't think about it that way. It just reminded me of Deluge when they cut to the newsreel proclaiming, "When will the Korean War end?" after Frank argues that it's a police action. They're really hitting the police action versus war debate in these later seasons, because it did not come up before. And I do agree with you that it is quite the interesting bit of commentary to say God always knows what's going on. In terms of, the turmoil.
And I'm thinking that potentially, by the time this episode would have aired, we would have been kind of further removed from the Korean War to a point where that idea of like, hey, it was a police action. No, actually, it was a war type of discussion. Well, I'm sure that it was a pretty big discussion as the Korean War was going on. I'm sure that as you get farther removed from it, it kind of becomes more and more ridiculous to have this war be considered a police action. So I'm thinking that maybe the writers kind of were throwing that in there as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And on the lighter end of things, the main conflict for this section of the episode with this group is that they are trying to get a brothel out of a schoolhouse. Sorry for the dramatic tone shift here.
No, you're great.
But that is what this is about. I thought this was so funny, and the way that they ultimately resolved this conflict was très magnifique. I loved it.
Yeah, I thought that it was actually super bold for them to not say sex workers, or prostitutes or whatever like terminology they might have used back then. They kind of used euphemisms like ladies of the night, and then they came out and said brothel too.
Yeah.
I just thought that it was actually pretty interesting that they would kind of go there and depict that and not have it be like, this is morally reprehensible type of thing. It was kind of just, this is the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in type of scene. And so I thought that it was pretty entertaining.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It was bold of them. It felt very like season 1, season 2, where they're a little more risque. But the actual jokes involving the madam and the brothel itself was so PG. I thought that was like they looked like a cute, fun gang. I don't know. And I loved Frank's confusion over what the oldest profession was when they're trying to tell him that it was a brothel. That he was like, "Oh, a bakery?" Like, that is, first of all, he's probably not wrong. That's probably like the second or third profession. But that is the brand of Frank that I love, when Frank is just like a little kid in a grown-up body. And he's just like an innocent guy who's like, "Oh, they must be bakers. They're working out of the schoolhouse. That's lovely."
I do have to say, Frank's naivete here was pretty cute. I liked that a lot. And because they needed like a real structure to house the hospital in, if they were actually planning on moving to this compound for the foreseeable future, they needed these women to kind of vacate this abandoned schoolhouse. And the way that they did it was heartbreaking, but also so heartfelt, because Klinger had to give up his dresses in order for these sex workers to leave the structured schoolhouse where the hospital had to be set up. And honestly, I need to know your thoughts about this, because losing the Klinger collection was truly just like a blow. I was so sad.
It went back to what I thought this episode was, where I thought it was, the beginning of a new era in terms of metaphor. I thought losing the Klinger collection was like this grand statement about how things are different now and we need to rebuild our base. And I thought it was really funny. I know we praised the episode earlier for its kind of strong continuity between seasons, how it may only be a couple days since like Deluge happened. But Klinger says that he spent 3 years building up the Klinger collection. And that just made my like alarm bells go off of being like, how long have they been there? Has he had the Klinger collection before they came to Korea? That's kind of crazy. How long has he been planning to do this? I thought they were only here for like a year at most at this point, not 3 years.
Ooh, that is some continuity error there. I would love to do a deep dive into whether Klinger was collecting these dresses maybe before, even when he was in Toledo.
He's a man who prepares. But yes, I will say losing the Klinger collection, even if so briefly, was kind of the end of an era. It did make me feel sad, similar to Radar needing to temporarily give up his animals. I was like, this is what defines Klinger. You can't take this from him.
I did think that it was really sweet, though, that the way that Colonel Potter got him to consent to the women having the dresses was, he said, "Do it for your country." And Klinger was like, "Huh? My country? Like, my country kind of sent me here. Like, I'm not doing her any favors." But then Colonel Potter said, "Do it for Toledo." And just the look of love and adoration in Klinger's eyes when Colonel Potter said, "Do it for Toledo," that just really sums up who Klinger was. Like, yeah, he might be like goofy and trying to get out of the army and stuff like that, but his love for Toledo will persist.
Yeah, and like on a more serious note, I thought that was like a great explanation of who Klinger is, that he does not really care for the American entity that sent him to war, but he loves his community.
Yeah.
He loves Toledo, Ohio. He cares so much for the actual people, not the overall structure of like the country itself. Was just like a great thing to put in this episode that like I felt really defined Klinger. And him giving up the dresses for that fact was, again, très magnifique. I thought was wonderful.
Yeah, I loved it. It was definitely a highlight of the episode. So finally, this patient is stable enough to be transported. So Hawkeye, Margaret, and Radar get this man on a helicopter, and they send him off, and they're like, all right, let's get out of here. And then they had this cute little sentimental moment about the camp. And I thought this also said something really sweet about Hawkeye and Margaret's characters here, where Hawkeye said, you know, a lot of men died here. Like basically saying, I wasn't good enough. I lost a lot of lives here. And his first instinct is kind of to go to his own failures. And he thinks about how many people he operated on who didn't make it. And then Margaret comes in to comment how many lives he did save and how many people do have their lives and are still alive because of him, and that he should be proud. So I kind of just liked this like little tiny back and forth. And Hawkeye also praises Margaret, says that she should also be proud because he kind of couldn't do it without her. So I really liked, again, this baseline of mutual respect that these two are showing for each other here. And we've seen it in the past, but I think that it's a lot stronger here. And I do think that it is going to persist throughout the rest of this season and the rest of the series.
I'm so excited for that. It definitely does support what you were saying earlier about Margaret being kind of the female counterpart to Hawkeye, that they both take their job so seriously and view the work as so essential, even though they're doing kind of two different roles in that job. I thought was very strong. And again, I didn't know the end of this episode. I had the impression that maybe we would have a new camp. I have not seen the latter half of the series, so I'm not familiar with like the set layout, you know? I thought maybe we were moving to a new set. So them taking the time to nostalgically look at the set that they're leaving behind, I was like, oh, that's like lovely that they are acknowledging that the era is over and we're moving to a new place. And then, surprise, surprise, we hear a convoy coming over the hills, and at first we think it's real dangerous, but then it turns out to be our boys. Our family's back. We're coming home.
Yes, and the anxiety here was so palpable. The writing, directing, and acting here was all really good, even though it was interspersed with a little bit of comedy where Hawkeye, Radar, and Margaret are trying to hide in the very bare structures of the tents. Yeah. And they're just like kind of running in and out of the doors, even though there is no walls of the tent. It was so good.
This was peak 70s sitcom humor. This was some Scooby-Doo nonsense going on right there. I loved it.
Yeah, and again, speaking of the anxiety of it too, I will, of course, always turn it back to Margaret. And to commend the writers here as well. I was thinking back to this scene, I think in like season 2, maybe, where the camp is being shelled and Margaret and Trapper get stuck in a supply tent together. And how Margaret kind of just falls into tears. She's crying. She needs Trapper to comfort her and all of this stuff. And then in this scene where there is like more palpable danger and she is scared, but she's kind of holding her own here and doing what she needs to do. I thought that it was really good on the writers who did this episode, that they weren't, I don't know, kind of making her fall all over Hawkeye or anything like that. I liked the respect that they put on Margaret's name in this one.
Margaret had like a lot of genuine anxiety. They say some pretty explicit stuff in terms of like what she's worried about, and not having her fall into Hawkeye's arms over the fear, I think does like speak to the respect of her character, that they express that she has this very real anxiety, but she's also not going to turn into like a a damsel in distress for comedy. They're going to take her a little more seriously this go around. I definitely agree with what you're saying here.
And I will note, fans of the show who have seen the rest of MASH will be like, what about this specific episode? Not to spoil anything,
Ooh.
But I don't believe that's canon. I don't agree with it.
What?
It doesn't exist to me. So we'll get to it.
We have a non-canon episode of MASH coming up? That's crazy.
Don't worry about it. We'll get to it. It's not great. Anyway, but fortunately for our little trio here, the enemy that they believe is coming their way is actually their brethren of the 4077.
Mm-hmm.
They were told to pack up all their stuff and move on back for like 20 minutes down the road, like with Frank.
All this hype and they're just right back where we started. Not that I'm complaining, but I was kind of looking forward to having like a new location. I was like looking forward to very distinct new era, but evidently we have the set we have, is what we have here, which I can't complain about.
I can say that when they were going to bug out and they were going to the new compound, we got to see Colonel Potter's horse again. And I don't think we've seen her since Radar gifted her to Colonel Potter in the beginning of last season. And she does make a lot of appearances in the rest of the series, so it was good to see little Sophie again.
Oh, I'm so excited for that. I didn't even really register that, this was a callback to an earlier episode. It was like, oh, of course, he has a horse to ride on. That just felt very natural to me.
Yeah.
But the reoccurrence of Sophie as a character, I'm looking forward to. Again, slightly new era. Now we have horse.
Exciting. Horse. When I found out patriarchy wasn't about horses, I lost interest. So I think that we've talked ad nauseum about this episode. So I want to get into our favorite lines. Ethan, did you have any? Okay, I have one that was like literally laugh out loud. I paused the episode because I thought it was so funny. I don't know if it's gonna come across though really well in like lines, but oh boy, was it good.
Not to sour our first episode of the season, but unfortunately, every line that I marked down, such as "do it for Toledo," was already mentioned organically in this episode. So I will mention that one thing we glossed over was that in the beginning of this episode, Klinger had the most absurd hat I've ever seen in my life. It was wonderful. I loved it.
I actually had that noted as well because I'm like, bring back these hats. Amazing.
I know.
I think that they were really popular in maybe like the 1920s. I want to say that's a total guess, but like that's just like the vibe I get. So I think we need to bring back these hats. If the listeners know what these hats are called, please let us know. I'm going to buy one.
Yes, we'll scour eBay.
So I have a lot of lines written down.
I'm looking forward to hearing them. I'm sorry I didn't do my due diligence. I thought this was a very funny episode, but I guess I wasn't focused. I wasn't on my ball.
So, okay. The line that really got me was in the beginning of episode 1 when the wounded are first coming in and a wounded soldier grabs Frank and says, oh Alice, like he's delusional, right? And Frank is freaking out. He's like, get off me. So, but he calls Frank Alice. And then Colonel Potter says to Hawkeye about giving him the thoracic spinal injury patient. Hawkeye says, oh, you're giving it to me? And Colonel Potter says, well, I sure as hell ain't gonna give this one to Alice. I lost. I had to pause the episode. I rewound. It was so funny. I'm not doing it justice, but please go back and listen to that line because man, oh man, if you want to know my brand of comedy, it's that. That's it.
That is a good quip. I do agree with you. That's very funny.
I think that like nothing tops that, so I'll leave it there. But yeah, so, oh boy, that really did it for me.
Another small thing I want to acknowledge that we missed in our general discussion was that BJ has a cockroach named Blue Velvet. There's an entire like tangent about it. I just thought this was a weird bit of like lore that they dropped in the episode, that they apparently play cockroach races all the time.
Yeah, it was BJ's racing cockroach, and it had apparently spawned a lot of winners too.
Just the fact that Radar could identify a cockroach is Radar's superpower, I guess.
Not only could he identify a cockroach, he identified the cockroach by its gait, because apparently it had a limping leg. So that's just all of this whole lines discussion. That's just so very MASH. It's just such a... when you think about the vibes of MASH, that's it.
Yeah, this is a very vibes episode. I do have to commend them for, slight change up in terms of who's behind the scenes, but they remained on the ball when making this episode. If I was not aware of any change happening, I would not think twice about it.
Same, me too.
So Vanessa, do you have any trivia for us in this premiere episode?
I do. Okay, so I have some trivia on Eileen Saki, who played the madam in this episode, like the head sex worker, but she also would go on to eventually play Rosie in the rest of the series.
Oh, no way! That's so cool!
Yeah, so there's a little bit of lore, but I think that I'll probably get into that when she actually takes over the role as Rosie.
Okay. What an interesting beginning, because Rosie's already in this episode, so it's like we have two Rosies in one.
Yeah, so that's part of the lore, actually, and it's really interesting. So I'm excited to get to that episode.
Ooh.
So on Eileen Saki, she was born Minako Eileen Sasaki, but was known by her stage name as Eileen Saki. There were reports that Saki was born in the Jerome War Camp in Arkansas in 1943, but I've also seen that she was actually born in Japan.
Oh, okay.
Saki's father worked in theater in Japan and worked as a gardener in the U.S., and he saved money for Saki to take singing and acting lessons.
Well, that's fun. I love how supportive her dad is.
Yeah, it's cute. Apparently, Saki snuck onto the Fox compound to meet Burt Metcalf to get this specific role. And then, a year later, he cast her as Rosie, and she remained in that role until the series ended.
That's crazy. That's dedication to a role that I imagine at the time she did not know would grow into a series regular role. That's really funny.
Yeah, I loved that when I found that out.
Persistence pays off.
Persistence does pay off. So besides MASH, Saki was in the 1974 movie Policewoman, History of the World Part 1, and Splash, which notably was one of Tom Hanks' first roles.
Ooh, my mom loves History of the World. It's one of her favorite movies of all time. And every time she tries to watch it with us, like, we don't understand. Not that I have anything against Mel Brooks, but it just doesn't hit me the way that it hits her. And Splash, that's a Ron Howard film. We have to shout out former guest star Ron Howard.
Wow, I actually didn't know that. That's so funny.
I think it's one of his first movies.
That makes sense.
Directed-wise.
That makes sense. And for TV, Saki also guest starred in shows like Good Times, Chips, Sidekicks, and Without a Trace. And unfortunately, Saki passed away pretty recently on May 1st, 2023 at 79 years old. And one thing that I do want to note is that Eileen Saki was a guest on MASH Matters. And then also when she passed away, they did a tribute episode to her as well. So we're going to be linking that in the description if anybody wants to take a listen and, remember Eileen Saki as the iconic Rosie.
Yeah. I remember when she passed away because we were already doing this podcast, I think, when that news dropped. And at the time, I had not seen like any episode with her, so we didn't really like comment on it. But I will definitely check out those MASH Matters episodes now that I'm going to be familiar with like her actual character in the show.
Yeah, and they're really good episodes. I really liked them a lot. So I also have some trivia on Gene Reynolds. Now, Larry Gelbart had left the show at this point. He left at the end of season 4. And I did a little trivia section on Larry Gelbart in season 2, episode 1. So if anyone's interested about Larry Gelbart and his career and stuff like that, his trivia section is in that episode. But I realized that I had never done a deep dive into Gene Reynolds' career. And this is going to be Gene Reynolds' last season as well. So I wanted to talk about him a little bit too.
Because I know that Gene Reynolds directed this episode. And I think in the opening credits, he's credited as executive producer before they even go to the main content of the episode. So hearing more about the man who directed a lot of the early seasons will be very fun to hear about.
Yeah, and he's really interesting too. So, Gene Reynolds was born in 1923 in Cleveland, Ohio. Reynolds was actually a child actor. He made his film debut in the short film Washy Iron, which was an Our Gang film. And Our Gang was a series of comedy short films that chronicled the fictitious lives of children in poverty and poorer neighborhoods. So I did not know that. I thought that was pretty cool.
That sounds like The Little Rascals almost.
Yeah.
But making movies about children in poverty as as comedic short films sounds insane to me. The culture was so different at that time.
Yeah. Reynolds often played the younger version of the stars of movies in the 1930s, such as the younger version of Ricardo Cortez in The Californian, Tyrone Power in The Old Chicago, James Stewart in Of Human Hearts, and Don Ameche in Sins of Man.
Playing a young Jimmy Stewart is crazy. That's a lot of pressure to put on a kid.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Like, if he never directed, he already has such a good career as a child actor. That's nuts.
Yeah, it's really cool. So Reynolds took a brief break from acting and served in World War II in the Navy. And when he returned from war service, he made several appearances in both movies and TV shows throughout the 40s and 50s. Some of his films include Adventures in Washington, Eagle Squadron, and The Country Girl. And TV shows include I Love Lucy and Whirlybirds, just to name a few.
Oh, I Love Lucy. That's huge.
Yeah. I can't wait to go back and try to find the episode that Gene Reynolds was in because I watch I Love Lucy reruns all the time.
Wow, you watch nothing made in the century other than HBO dramas. If it's a comedy, you're watching 1980 or earlier. That's really funny.
That is extremely true. I feel very seen right now. So Reynolds moved towards directing and writing in the 1950s and directed episodes of Leave It to Beaver, The Andy Griffith Show, Father of the Bride, The Farmer's Daughter, and Hogan's Heroes, among several others.
Ooh, that's a good hit list. Those are all big shows, I feel.
Yeah. Reynolds was the executive producer of a groundbreaking show on ABC called Room 222 that first premiered in 1969. The show was about a black teacher and his students, and the show dealt with some really taboo topics for the time, such as drug use, prejudice and racism, and dropping out of school.
Oh.
It was Reynolds' kind of precursor to the groundbreaking work he did on the first few seasons of MASH, and I just really liked to see that.
So it sounds like Gene Reynolds was a guy to push barriers. Like, he didn't just want to do the funny sitcoms. He wanted to really experiment with storytelling is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and apparently Reynolds was let go of Room 222 when the network wanted to take a more funny approach to the show rather than serious. So I feel like Gene Reynolds was kind of our guy who brought the drama to the dramedy. So I do agree that it does seem like he really wanted to push boundaries with what he could do in comedy.
That's really cool. We often praise the writers as the architects of the episodes, but, the director and the producer obviously have a lot of say in the show as well. And it's really cool that as director, he had this history of, wanting to do more than just, the standard laugh-a-minute sitcom.
Yeah, definitely. So while Reynolds was working on MASH, he produced 22 episodes of the show Lou Grant, which starred Ed Asner and was the third spinoff of The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Isn't that funny?
Third spinoff is crazy to me. That's a lot. That's a long lineage.
It might be the show that had the most spinoffs of any TV show in history, actually, if I'm thinking about that.
There's a strong possibility of that. Either that or maybe Happy Days. Happy Days ran wild for a long time.
That is true. Reynolds was nominated for 26 Emmy Awards in his career and won 6 times for both MASH and Lou Grant.
That's awesome.
He won the Directors Guild Award for Outstanding Director in a Comedy Series and Drama Series for MASH and Lou Grant, respectively. After his work on MASH and Lou Grant, Reynolds was elected president of the Directors Guild of America and served in the role between 1993 and 1997.
That's so cool. I feel like we have a lot of union heads working on the show between him and like Mike Farrell. We have like the SAG and the DGA pretty well represented. That's really cool.
Yeah, this was the era of like strong unions, I think.
Yeah.
Reynolds was married twice, and both of his wives actually appeared as nurses in MASH. His second wife is actually going to be a pretty big part of one of the episodes coming up in this season, so watch out for that.
I will.
And unfortunately, Reynolds passed away from heart failure at the age of 96. And while it is tragic when anybody passes away, 96 is a pretty strong, hearty age.
Yeah.
And also, MASH Matters did a podcast episode about Gene Reynolds when he passed away. So we're going to be linking that as well if anybody wants to take a listen.
Sounds good. I will check that out. Sounds like a very cool guy.
Yeah. Okay, so Ethan, what was your martini rating for this episode?
You know, after our discussion, I do have to say that I really love this episode. I know it's one of your favorites, and talking about it with you just made me like appreciate it a lot more because it highlighted how much fun stuff is in this episode, as well as the more emotional backbone, no pun intended. So I think I have to give this season premiere a 5 out of 5. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling quite strongly.
Wow. Here I am being like, I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 because I'm remaining objective.
Wow. You and your objectivism. Get out of here, Ayn Rand.
This is one of my favorite episodes, just probably because it sticks out so much to me from when I watched it as a youngin'. But I think objectively, it definitely is like a 4 out of 5 for me. It's I can't exactly explain why.
Okay. That is, not going to argue. We're just going to have to tussle one of these days about it. But, on mic, we'll just have to agree to disagree because I think this is a wonderful episode. I think it is. The vibes are good, but I can't disagree with your objectivism because whatever,
my
man.
Objectivity, yes, as an attorney, yes.
Yes, your objective opinion is now objectively superior than mine.
Oh my goodness.
So just to wrap up, we'd like to give thanks to Jacob for your Balco for being our technical consultant, Melissa, Vanessa's sister, for our awesome cover art, and of course our listeners. Links to our music, social media, and contact with the show are in the description, as always. And join us next week for Season 5, Episode 3, Margaret's Engagement. Ooh, I wonder what's going to happen there. But until then, smoke some Cuban cigars from Newark, New Jersey. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Goodbye, everyone.
We didn't even mention the New Jersey call-out. How dare we?